The Silvervale estate glittered like a diamond, but from where I stood in the shadows, it just looked like a cage. My ex-husband smiled at his new bride, oblivious that the woman he destroyed was watching. They had spent over $300,000 on this wedding, yet the single file in my pocket would cost them everything. I did not come here to catch the bouquet. I came here to light the match. My name is Isabella Crane. I am 32 years old, and by day, I work as a senior fraud investigator for Summit Line Analytics, a private firm that specializes in untangling the financial lies of the ultra-wealthy. I have spent the last 2 years burying myself in spreadsheets and forensic accounting, learning exactly how people hide their sins behind shell companies and offshore accounts. But tonight, standing in the shadows of the Silvervale estate, I was not looking for hidden assets. I was looking at the architects of my own destruction. The venue was obscenely beautiful. Silvervale was the newest crown jewel of the American suburbs, a sprawling manor that smelled of imported lilies and old money. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of a string quartet playing something classical and pretentious. Every detail was perfect, from the crystal chandeliers that likely cost more than my annual salary to the silk tablecloths that shimmered under the ambient lighting. It was a masterpiece of illusion, designed to make everyone forget the ugly truth rotting underneath the floorboards. I was not supposed to be here. My name was definitely not on the guest list of 300 people. I had slipped in through the service entrance, dressed in a severe black gown that allowed me to blend into the periphery. Just another face in the darkened corners of the ballroom. I watched them from behind a pillar wrapped in white roses. At the altar stood Patrick Langford, my ex-husband. As the heir to the Langford Dominion real estate empire, he looked every inch the golden boy his mother had molded him to be. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his smile practiced and charming. He looked happy, or at least he looked the way a man is supposed to look when he is securing his legacy. Standing opposite him was Miranda Hale. She was radiant in a dress that probably cost $50,000. Miranda was a lifestyle designer, a woman whose entire career was built on making things look perfect on the surface. She had curated this wedding with the same ruthless ambition she had used to dismantle my marriage 4 years ago. To the onlookers, this was a fairy tale. To me, it was a crime scene. The guests whispered among themselves, their voices carrying over the music. I could hear snippets of their conversations, little daggers of gossip that confirmed everything I despised about this social circle. A woman in emerald silk leaned toward her neighbor and murmured about how relieved Victoria Langford must be. She said it was a blessing Patrick had finally found a woman of his own caliber, someone who could actually give the family an heir. They spoke of my divorce as if it were a tragedy for Patrick, a chaotic mistake that had finally been corrected. They had no idea that the chaos had been manufactured, dose by calculated dose. Then, the atmosphere shifted slightly. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall creaked open, and a man walked in. He was not dressed for a wedding. He wore a rumpled gray suit, and his eyes carried a manic energy that unsettled the ushers. It was Gareth Langford, Patrick's estranged cousin. I watched as a ripple of tension moved through the front row. Victoria Langford, the matriarch and the true power behind the Dominion, stiffened in her seat. Gareth was not supposed to be here either. His presence was a jagged crack in their perfect porcelain surface. The officiant asked if anyone had any reason why these two should not be wed. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Most people held their breath out of tradition, but I held mine out of anticipation. My hand slipped into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against the cold, sharp edge of a folded dossier. It contained medical records, bank transfers, and emails that proved my inability to conceive was not a biological failure, but a purchased outcome. I tightened my grip on the paper. Patrick was about to promise his life to Miranda, but I was holding the grenade that would blow their future apart. The time for weeping was over. The time for the truth had arrived. 4 years ago, the air in the Langford household felt less like oxygen and more like pressurized glass. I remember the day I married Patrick, thinking our love was a fortress strong enough to withstand his mother, Victoria Langford. I was naive. Victoria was not just a mother, she was the iron-fisted CEO of Langford Dominion, a woman who viewed family members as assets and marriage as a merger. To her, I was a liability, a middle-class data analyst with no pedigree and no trust fund, someone who had inexplicably captured the heart of her golden heir. The dismantling of my spirit was not sudden. It was a slow, calculated erosion. It began with subtle comments about my background and evolved into an obsessive critique of my ability to provide the family with a successor. 6 months into our marriage, Victoria sat us down in her mahogany-paneled study and insisted that we start a fertility plan immediately. She claimed that time was money and biology was unforgiving. She introduced us to Dr. Arrington, the family's private physician, a man with cold hands and a smile that never reached his eyes. He suggested a regimen of what he called vigorous fertility boosters to ensure a high-quality pregnancy. I agreed because I wanted to please Patrick. I wanted to prove to Victoria that I could give them what they wanted. But the treatments were a nightmare. Twice a week. I went to the private clinic for injections that burned going in and left me nauseous for days. Within 2 months, I barely recognized myself in the mirror. My skin turned sallow, my hair began to thin, and I was plagued by migraines that felt like lightning strikes behind my eyes. I was constantly exhausted, my emotions swinging violently from despair to rage. When I complained to Patrick, he just held my hand loosely and repeated the words his mother had fed him. He told me that beauty was pain and that motherhood required sacrifice. He said I was being dramatic and that Dr. Arrington knew what was best. I looked for empathy in his eyes, but I only found a reflection of Victoria's ambition. He was so desperate to secure his inheritance that he chose to ignore the fact that his wife was withering away in front of him. Despite the agony and the regimented schedule, there was no pregnancy. Month after month, the tests came back negative. With every single line, Victoria's disdain grew sharper. She stopped inviting me to family dinners. She began referring to me in the third person when I was in the room, lamenting Patrick's poor investment in a barren wife. The passion that had once consumed Patrick and me turned into a cold, resentful silence. He started sleeping in the guest room, claiming my tossing and turning kept him awake, but I knew he just could not stand to look at his failing project. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening in November. I was weak, recovering from another round of injections that had left me vomiting for 6 hours. Victoria came to the house, not with soup or sympathy, but with a legal team. She placed a stack of documents on the coffee table, a post-nuptial agreement. She told me that since I had failed to fulfill the primary clause of our unspoken contract, the terms of our marriage needed to be restructured to protect the Langford assets. Patrick stood by the window, swirling a glass of scotch, refusing to meet my gaze. They wanted me to sign away my rights to any future alimony in exchange for continued medical coverage. I looked at the man I had vowed to love, the man who had promised to protect me, and saw nothing but a stranger in a tailored suit. I realized then that I was not a wife to them. I was an incubator that had malfunctioned. I signed the papers with a shaking hand, not because I agreed, but because I needed to get out of that room before I suffocated. That night, I packed 2 suitcases and left the Langford mansion, leaving behind the jewelry, the clothes, and the illusion that I had ever been part of their family. I walked out broken, sick, and alone, convinced that I was the one who had failed. I had no idea then that the game had been rigged from the very first shot. Work became my anesthesia. In the 2 years following the divorce, I did not date. I did not take vacations, and I certainly did not sleep for more than 5 hours a night. I threw myself into the sterile, binary world of Summit Line analytics, where numbers never lied and every discrepancy had a logical explanation. I became the best investigator in the department because I had nothing else to go home to. I lived for the hunt, for that singular moment when the chaotic data aligned to reveal the ugly truth of a crime. It started as a routine assignment. My director handed me a file on a mid-level private equity fund suspected of laundering money for an overseas cartel. The job required me to trace a web of shell companies designed to look like legitimate businesses. I spent 3 weeks peeling back the layers of corporate obfuscation, following the digital trail of money from the Cayman Islands to Delaware. That was when I found it. Buried deep within the portfolio of a subsidiary called Vestra Holdings was a recurring transaction stream linked to an entity I knew all too well, Langford Dominion. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence. The business world is smaller than people think, and the Langfords had their fingers in half the real estate deals on the East Coast. But my training kicked in, overriding my instinct to look away. I zoomed in on the ledger. The payments were flagged as miscellaneous consulting fees and medical support services. The amounts were irregular but substantial, ranging from $5,000 to $15,000 per transaction. The recipient was a generic-looking LLC, but when I ran the tax identification number through our proprietary database, the owner's name flashed on my screen in neon red letters. It was Dr. Arrington, the man who had smiled at me while he injected poison into my veins. My breath hitched in my throat. Why would a real estate conglomerate be paying a fertility specialist nearly $200,000 over the course of 8 months? And why were the payments routed through a shell company used for high-risk assets? Mara Jensen, the senior analyst who sat in the cubicle next to mine, rolled her chair over when she saw me staring blankly at the monitor. Mara was the only person at Summit Line who knew the details of my divorce. She looked at the screen, then at my pale face, and her expression hardened. She told me to close the file. She warned me that tracing this line further was not just a conflict of interest, it was dangerous. She reminded me that the Langfords had lawyers who could turn my life into a legal hellscape if they caught me snooping. I nodded at her, pretending to agree. But the moment she left for lunch, I opened a second window. I pulled up my own encrypted personal cloud where I kept the digital copies of my old calendars and medical diaries. I needed to know! I placed the transaction log on the left side of the screen and my personal calendar on the right. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely control the mouse. I started cross-referencing dates. The first payment of $10,000 cleared on January 12th. My first appointment with Dr. Arrington was on January 13th. The next payment of $5,000 was processed on February 1st. My second round of injections was on February 2nd. The pattern was absolute. Every single time I went into that clinic to have my body violated under the guise of medical care, a wire transfer hit Dr. Arrington's account 24 hours prior. The correlation was 100%. The cold realization washed over me, numbing the grief and replacing it with a terrifying clarity. They were not paying for fertility treatments. They were paying for a service that required discretion. They were paying him to make sure I never conceived. The erratic hormones, the sickness, the constant failure. It was not my body betraying me. It was a transaction. I had been a line item in their budget, a problem being managed by a paid contractor. I saved the data to an external drive and wiped the search history from my work terminal. I sat there in the hum of the office, surrounded by the banality of ringing phones and typing colleagues, and felt the last remaining piece of my old self die. The Isabella who wanted to be a mother was gone. In her place sat a woman who had just found the weapon she needed. I was going to investigate them, not as an employee of Summit Line, but as a victim who had survived. The Langfords thought they had bought silence, but all they had really bought was a war. I made an appointment with Dr. Sterling, a specialist in reproductive endocrinology who operated out of a university hospital 3 counties away from the Langford influence. I paid in cash and used my maiden name, terrified that even a digital footprint might alert Victoria. I needed to know if my body was truly broken, or if the sickness that had plagued me for 4 years was something else entirely. 3 days later, I sat in Dr. Sterling's office. The fluorescent lights hummed with a sound that grated against my nerves. He held a tablet in his hands, his expression grim. He told me that my reproductive system was perfectly healthy. There were no cysts, no scarring, and no genetic anomalies. My breath caught in my throat. I asked him why. Then, had I been unable to conceive for 2 years? He swiped across the screen and showed me the toxicology report from my hair follicle test. He explained that my system showed residual traces of a high-potency gonadotropin-releasing hormone antagonist. It was a drug used to treat severe hormonal cancers, but in a healthy woman, it effectively shut down the ovaries. He looked me in the eye and said that the dosage I had received was not a fertility booster. It was a chemical sterilization agent. Someone had been systematically poisoning me to ensure I would never become pregnant. The room spun. I gripped the armrests of the chair to keep from falling. I flashed back to those mornings in the Langford estate. Victoria standing over me with a glass of water, watching me take my supplements. I remembered Patrick holding my hand while Dr. Arrington injected the burning fluid into my arm, telling me it was liquid hope. It was not hope. It was a weapon. They had not just rejected me, they had violated my body to protect their bloodline from being diluted by mine. I went home and threw up in the sink. Then, I sat on my kitchen floor and cried until my throat was raw. But the tears eventually dried, leaving behind a cold, hard rage. I pulled up the spreadsheet of the payments again. The dates were undeniable. Every injection coincided with a wire transfer. They had paid nearly $200,000 to rob me of my future. 2 nights later, my encrypted email chimed. It was a message from an anonymous sender, simply signed with the initial E. The text was brief. It said that she had been a nurse at Dr. Arrington's clinic for 10 years and that she could not sleep at night anymore. She told me that Arrington kept a shadow database, a server separate from the main hospital records where he stored the real charts of his special clients. She gave me an IP address and a temporary administrative password. She said I had 20 minutes before the system would reset. I did not hesitate. I set up my laptop on the dining table, the glow of the screen the only light in the apartment. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I was not a hacker, but I was a forensic analyst. I knew how to navigate complex data structures and locate hidden directories. I accessed the remote server, bypassing the front-end interface and diving straight into the raw file folders. The database was vast, filled with the secrets of the city's elite, but I searched only for one name. I typed Langford into the query bar. The system churned for a few agonizing seconds before a single folder appeared. It was password protected, but the nurse had provided the decryption key in her second message. I typed it in Victoria. The folder opened. Inside, there were PDFs of my true medical charts, detailing the dosage of the inhibitors and the notes on my declining health. But it was the parent directory that stopped my heart. My file was not listed under patient care or fertility treatments. It was stored in a subfolder titled Project Elimination. I stared at the words, the white letters burning into my retinas. I was not a patient to them. I was a project, a problem to be eliminated. I downloaded every single byte of data, copying the files to 3 separate hard drives. As the progress bar hit 100%, I slammed the laptop shut. They had tried to eliminate me, but all they had done was document their own crime. And now, I held the evidence that would turn their perfect world into ash. The files I stole from Dr. Arrington's server were just the beginning. Once I knew where to look, the rest of the puzzle pieces began to snap into place with terrifying precision. I spent the next 48 hours digging into Victoria Langford's personal financial history, using every backdoor I had learned in my decade as a fraud investigator. What I found made the medical abuse look like merely one chapter in a much larger book of manipulation. Victoria had not just paid for my sterilization, she had budgeted for my divorce 3 years before it even happened. I found a wire transfer of $50,000 labeled Legal Contingency, PL. It dated 2 months after my wedding. She had bet against her own son's marriage from the start, but the real shock came when I cross-referenced the recipient of a recurring monthly stipend from the Langford Charitable Foundation. The name was Miranda Hale. For 5 years, Victoria had been funding Miranda's lifestyle brand. Hale and Hardy. The startup capital, the studio rent, the PR campaigns, it was all paid for by Langford money. Miranda was not just a random woman Patrick had fallen for after our split. She was a plant. She was the hand-picked replacement, groomed and subsidized by Victoria to step in the moment I was removed. Miranda was the compliant, pedigree-perfect doll that Victoria had always wanted. And my marriage had been nothing more than a placeholder until Miranda was ready for the stage. The upcoming wedding at Silvervale Estate was not just a celebration of love, it was a victory lap. It was Victoria's way of cementing the Langford legacy and washing away the mistake of my existence. They were going to rewrite history in front of 300 of society's elite, presenting themselves as the perfect American family. I sat in my dark apartment, the blue light of the monitor illuminating my face, and made a choice. I could take this evidence to a lawyer, settle for a quiet payout, and disappear. Or I could burn their house down while they were all still inside. I chose the fire. I needed a plan that would destroy them on 3 fronts: their reputation, their finances, and their freedom. I mapped it out on my wall with sticky notes and red string. Phase 1 was the medical truth. Phase 2 was the financial fraud I had uncovered in their business dealings. Phase 3 was the public humiliation. I called it Operation Silvervale Enlightenment. Mara came over the next evening, bringing takeout and a look of terrified concern. When I showed her the board, she went pale. She told me that people like the Langfords did not just get sued, they made people disappear. She grabbed my shoulders and begged me to think about my safety. She said that justice was a nice idea, but survival was better. I looked at her and told her that I had already survived the worst thing they could do to me. They had taken my ability to be a mother. There was nothing left for me to lose. I reached out to an old contact from my university days, a journalist named Elias Thorne who wrote for a major investigative paper in New York. We met in a diner 2 towns over. I slid a flash drive across the table. It contained a sample of the medical records and the financial trails linking Victoria to the shell companies. Elias looked at the files on his laptop, his eyes widening with every scroll. He told me this was the story of the decade, but he needed more to make it stick in court. He needed the smoking gun that tied the money directly to the intent. I told him he would have it. I spent the next week compiling a dossier so thick it needed a binder. I drafted the legal complaint myself, detailing every count of bodily harm, fraud, and conspiracy. I was not just going to sue them, I was going to indict them in the court of public opinion before the police even put the cuffs on. The wedding was in 3 days. They were expecting champagne and caviar. I was bringing the apocalypse. Getting into Silvervale Estate required more than just courage. It required a fake identity and $2,000 in cash paid to a corrupt staffing agency. I entered the grounds at 4 in the afternoon the day before the ceremony, dressed in the nondescript black uniform of the lighting crew. My badge identified me as Elena, a freelance technician. No one looked twice at me. To the wealthy, the people who keep the lights on are invisible. I made my way to the main ballroom, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The room was empty, a cavernous space draped in white silk and crystals. I located the main audiovisual console tucked behind a velvet curtain. This was the brain of the wedding, the hub that would control the music, the lights, and the slideshow of happy memories Patrick and Miranda planned to inflict on their guests. I reached into my tool belt and pulled out a small black drive. "I am in position," I whispered into the tiny microphone clipped to my collar. "Signal is strong." Derek Rowe's voice crackled in my earpiece. Derek was a white hat hacker I had recruited for this specific task. He was parked in a van 3 miles away, ready to override the system. "Plug it into the auxiliary port. Once the link is established, I own their screens." I slotted the drive into the port. A small green light blinked once, then turned solid. We were live, but I was not done. I needed to see Miranda's staging area. I knew from the blueprints that the bride had been given the master suite in the East Wing for her preparations. I slipped through the service corridors, dodging a florist carrying a massive arrangement of hydrangeas. When I reached the suite, the door was unlocked. The room smelled of lilies and arrogance. On a vanity table sat a silver laptop, open and humming. Miranda felt so safe here, so untouchable, that she had not even bothered to log out. I sat down and began to scroll. I expected to find wedding plans or honeymoon itineraries. Instead, I found a folder titled Asset Allocation. I clicked it open and felt the blood drain from my face. There were bank transfers from Victoria Langford to Miranda dating back 3 years. That was 1 year before my divorce. While I was lying in bed, sick from the injections, Victoria was already paying Miranda a monthly retainer of $5,000. I found an email chain between them. "Isabella is becoming difficult," Victoria had written. "Stick to the plan. Once the medical records are finalized, the path is clear for you." Miranda had replied, "I can wait. Patrick is worth the investment." They had not just pushed me out, they had hired my replacement while I was still cooking dinner in their kitchen. I felt a surge of nausea, but I forced my hands to move. I inserted a second drive and copied everything: the emails, the bank statements, the strategy documents. This was not just a love affair, it was a corporate takeover of a human life. Suddenly, the heavy sound of boots echoed in the hallway. "I left the tablet in here," a male voice grumbled. It was the head of security. I looked around frantically. There was nowhere to go but the walk-in closet filled with Miranda's trousseau. I dove behind a rack of silk robes just as the door handle turned. Through the crack in the louvers, I watched the security chief stomp into the room. He scanned the area, his eyes lingering on the vanity where I had just been sitting. "Who left this open?" he muttered. He walked toward the closet. I stopped breathing. I pressed my hand over my mouth, my body rigid. If he opened the door, it was over. He reached for the handle. Then, his radio squawked. "Chief, we have a delivery truck blocked at the north gate. We need authorization." He grunted, released the handle, and turned around. "On my way!" The moment the door clicked shut behind him, I scrambled out of the closet. I did not wait. I grabbed my drive and bolted for the service elevator. I took the stairs down 3 flights, my legs shaking, and slipped out through the catering loading dock. The cool night air hit my face, and I finally exhaled. I looked back at the mansion, glowing against the dark sky. They were sleeping soundly in there, confident in their money and their power. They had no idea that the ghost of their past had just walked through their walls. I touched the drive in my pocket. "Sleep well, Patrick," I whispered to the darkness. "Tomorrow, everything falls." The sun had lowered itself behind the manicured hills of the estate by the time the ceremony began at 6 o'clock. It was a scene painted in shades of cream and gold, a masterclass in performative happiness. The orchestra played a swelling symphony that likely cost more than a teacher makes in a year. To the 300 guests seated on velvet chairs, this was the romantic event of the season. To me, it was a theater of war disguised as a wedding. Patrick stood at the altar, looking handsome in that superficial way he always did. But I knew him better than anyone. I saw the tightness in his jaw and the way his fingers kept twitching at his side. He was smiling, but his eyes were scanning the crowd with a frantic energy. He was looking for the heavy hitters of the business world, the senators and the tycoons who were supposed to validate his status, but many of the seats reserved for the power players were conspicuously empty. He did not know yet that my anonymous tips to the press had already started to circulate, making the Langford name radioactive before the first glass of champagne was poured. Then the music swelled, and Miranda appeared. She was a vision of calculated perfection. Her dress was an architectural marvel of lace and silk, designed to highlight exactly what I could not provide: youth and fertility. She glided down the aisle not like a woman in love, but like a CEO walking into a board meeting she knew she had already won. Victoria sat in the front row, her back as rigid as steel. She was not watching her son, she was scanning the perimeter, managing the event like a military operation. She nodded at the photographers, directing the narrative with the tilt of her head. I stood at the very back of the garden, concealed by the deep shade of a weeping willow and the large floral archway. I was dressed in a simple navy gown that allowed me to blend into the twilight. Around me, the whispers of the guests drifted like smoke. Two women in front of me leaned their heads together. One of them murmured that it was such a relief Patrick had moved on from that sad first wife. The other replied that it was a tragedy when a woman could not fulfill her natural duty, implying that my infertility was a character flaw rather than a medical condition. Their words stung, but the pain was distant now, dulled by the armor of the truth I carried in my pocket. As Miranda reached the altar, Patrick looked up. His gaze drifted over her shoulder, past the guests, and for a split second, it locked onto the darkness where I stood. His eyes widened. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head slightly as if trying to clear a hallucination. He thought I was a ghost born of his own guilty conscience. He turned his attention back to his bride, convincing himself that I was thousands of miles away, broken and forgotten. The officiant began the ceremony, speaking of loyalty and truth. It was almost laughable. Miranda took Patrick's hands and began to recite her vows. Her voice was trembling with practiced emotion. She spoke of how she had loved him from the moment they met and how their bond was built on honesty. Every word was a lie, polished until it shined like a diamond. The guests dabbed at their eyes, moved by the performance. "I promise to stand by you," Miranda said, her voice catching perfectly, "through all the seasons of our lives." At that exact moment, the massive projection screen behind the altar, which was displaying a loop of their engagement photos, let out a sharp, electronic screech, the image of the happy couple distorted, fracturing into pixels of static. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Victoria stood up halfway, signaling furiously to the technical booth. The screen went black for a heartbeat, creating a sudden, heavy silence in the garden. I stepped out from the shadow of the willow tree. The gravel crunched softly under my heels, but in the quiet, it sounded like thunder. I walked into the center aisle, the lone figure in blue against a sea of black tuxedos and pastel dresses. I did not run. I did not scream. I just stood there, letting the light from the hanging lanterns catch my face. The time for hiding was over. The show was about to begin. The screen behind the altar did not return to the slideshow of Miranda's engagement trip to Paris. Instead, it illuminated the garden with the harsh, cold light of a bank ledger. The text was magnified to 10 feet tall, making the crime visible to the last row of seats. It showed a wire transfer dated 3 years ago. The sender was Victoria Langford. The recipient was Dr. Arrington. The amount was $150,000, but it was the memo line, highlighted in glowing red, that made the first scream rise from the audience chemical suppression protocol. Patient I.C. The text dissolved and was replaced by a medical abstract describing the drug I had been injected with. The words permanent ovarian failure and forced sterilization hovered over the bride and groom like a curse. The The murmurs in the crowd turned into a roar of panic and disbelief. People were standing up, squinting at the screen, their champagne glasses forgotten. Then, the audio cut in. It was Derek Rowe's masterpiece. The speakers that were meant to play the wedding march now broadcast a distorted but unmistakable voice. It was Dr. Arrington, recorded during a private confession I had secured days ago. I had no choice. The doctor's voice boomed over the terrified guests. Victoria told me that if Isabella got pregnant, she would ruin my practice. The injections were designed to mimic infertility. It was a transaction. She paid for a barren daughter-in-law. Patrick froze. He looked like a man who had been shot in the chest. He turned slowly toward his mother. Victoria was gripping the back of her chair so hard her knuckles were white, her face drained of all blood. Miranda stood there, clutching her bouquet, looking less like a bride and more like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. I continued walking until I stood at the foot of the altar steps. The silence that fell over the crowd was heavy and suffocating. I looked directly at Patrick. "You spent 4 years comforting me while I cried over negative tests," I said, my voice calm and carrying clearly through the garden. "You told me we would get through it together, but while you were holding my hand, your mother was holding the checkbook that ensured I would never carry your child." "Isabella," Patrick whispered, his voice cracking. This is insane." "It is not insanity." "Patrick, it is a receipt," I replied. "Enough!" Victoria shrieked, finally finding her voice. She stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Security. Get this woman out of here. She is hysterical." "I don't think security can help you with this part. Aunt Victoria," a deep voice called out from the side entrance. Gareth Langford stepped onto the dais. He was the ghost at the feast, the cousin Victoria had ruthlessly ousted from the board 5 years ago. He held a microphone in one hand and a stack of documents in the other. He looked at the crowd, a wolfish grin on his face. "You all just saw how she handles family," Gareth said, gesturing to the screen. "Now, let me show you how she handles money." He signaled to the booth. The screen changed again. This time, it displayed a complex web of offshore accounts and falsified profit reports for Langford Dominion. "For 7 years, Victoria has been inflating the company's asset value to secure loans she cannot repay," Gareth announced, his voice booming. "She has been cooking the books to fund this lavish lifestyle. Langford Dominion is not an empire. It is a shell game, and the shell is empty." The reaction was instantaneous. I saw 3 major investors in the front row pull out their phones, dialing their lawyers immediately. The guests were no longer just watching a scandal, they were documenting a collapse. Phones were raised in the air, recording every second of the carnage. The flashbulbs from the press, who had pushed past the confused security at the gates, began to pop like gunfire. Victoria slumped back into her chair, looking small and defeated. Miranda dropped her bouquet, the white flowers hitting the ground with a soft thud that signaled the end of the fantasy. The wedding was over. The trial had begun. I pulled my phone from my clutch and pressed the final command key. On the massive screen behind the altar, the display shifted from static documents to a live feed of the global financial news. The headline running across the bottom of the screen was devastatingly simple: Langford Dominion investigated for massive Ponzi scheme. The graph next to it showed the aftermarket value of their stock plummeting like a stone dropped in a well. It had lost 40% of its value in less than 10 minutes. The garden erupted into chaos. The wealthy investors in the audience were not just shocked, they were furious. I watched as the CEO of Sterling Bank stood up and shouted that he was pulling his funding immediately. Victoria Langford, the woman who had once looked at me as if I were a stain on her carpet, collapsed onto the grass. She clawed at her chest, gasping for air, but no one rushed to help her. They were too busy calling their brokers to salvage what was left of their own portfolios. Miranda Hale stood amidst the wreckage of her perfect day. She looked at the screen, then at the sobbing Victoria, and finally at Patrick, who was paralyzed with fear. She did the math in her head. Without the Langford fortune, Patrick was just a spineless man with a controlling mother. She did not even look at him. She gathered the heavy skirts of her $50,000 dress and ran back down the aisle, pushing past the confused photographers. She was fleeing the sinking ship before the water even touched her ankles. Patrick scrambled down the altar steps and grabbed my arm. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, the eyes of a child who had broken a vase and wanted his mother to fix it. He told me that we could stop this. He said that if I issued a retraction, if I told the press it was a misunderstanding, we could save the company. He actually believed that there was still a we to speak of. I pulled my arm away from his grip. I looked him dead in the eye and told him the truth. I said that I did not come here to save him. I came here to save myself. I told him that the Isabella he knew had died in that clinic 4 years ago, and the woman standing in front of him was just the executor of his estate. The wail of sirens cut through the evening air, drowning out the string quartet that had stopped playing long ago. Blue and red lights flashed against the white stone of the mansion. A team of federal agents swarmed the garden. They did not head for the buffet. They headed straight for the front row. I watched as they pulled Victoria to her feet. The matriarch of the Dominion did not look regal anymore. She looked old and terrified as they clicked the handcuffs onto her wrists. The agent read her rights, listing charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit medical battery. Gareth stepped forward, flanked by 2 other board members who had emerged from the crowd. He looked down at Patrick, who was trembling. Gareth told him that effective immediately. The board had voted to remove him from all executive positions. Patrick was no longer the heir. He was a liability. He was stripped of his title, his salary, and his legacy in the span of 60 seconds. As the police led Victoria away and Patrick sank to his knees in the dirt, a man in a sharp gray suit approached me. It was Gareth's personal attorney. He handed me a thick manila envelope. I opened it to find a certified cashier's check. It was a settlement payout from the liquid assets Gareth had seized just moments before the accounts were frozen. The number was staggering. It was $10 million. It was payment for every tear, every injection, and every stolen dream. I held the check in my hand, feeling the weight of it. It did not replace what I had lost, but it was enough to build a fortress where no one could ever hurt me again. I walked out of the Silver Vale estate gates, leaving the chaos of flashing lights and screaming sirens behind me. The paparazzi shouted my name, hungry for a quote, but I did not stop. I did not look back at the ruin I had caused. For the first time in 4 years, the air in my lungs felt clean. I drove away into the night, and with every mile I put between myself and the Langford family, the heavy weight on my chest lifted. The next morning, Gareth Langford called me. He was euphoric. He told me that with Victoria in handcuffs and Patrick disgraced, the board was his to command. He offered me a position as a senior consultant to help clean up the financial mess Victoria had left behind. He said we could rule the company together. I declined without a second thought. I told him that I had not burned down the castle just so I could sit on the throne. I wanted nothing to do with their money, their politics, or their toxic legacy. I was done investigating the darkness. I wanted to live in the light. I took my settlement and moved to a small coastal town 300 miles north. I bought a weathered cottage with a porch that looked out over the gray, churning Atlantic Ocean. It was quiet there. No one cared about stock prices or society weddings. I spent my mornings running on the sand and my evenings reading books that had nothing to do with fraud or betrayal. 2 months later, Mara drove up to visit. We sat on my porch wrapped in wool blankets, drinking tea. She told me that the prosecutors were ruthless. Victoria was facing 20 years in federal prison, and her assets had been seized. The Project Elimination files had been the final nail in her coffin. The public revulsion was absolute. Mara also told me that Patrick was living in a rented apartment, working a mid-level sales job, completely cut off from the family trust. Patrick sent me letters. They arrived in generic white envelopes. In them, he apologized. He claimed he was a victim too, that he had been weak but never malicious. He begged for a chance to explain. I did not burn them in anger. I simply dropped them into the recycling bin unopened. He was a ghost to me now, a shadow of a life that no longer existed. I did not retire, however. I used a portion of my settlement to open a boutique firm called the Vanguard Agency. We specialized in forensic accounting for women going through high-conflict divorces. I hired a team of sharp, hungry analysts, and we dedicated ourselves to finding hidden assets for wives who were being bullied by powerful husbands. Every time we won a case, every time I saw a woman reclaim her dignity, I felt a piece of my own soul stitch itself back together. My body healed along with my spirit, the toxins flushed out of my system, replaced by the salt air and the peace of my new life. One Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Dr. Sterling. He had the results of my latest panel. His voice was warm when he told me the news. My hormone levels had normalized. The damage was not permanent. He told me that I was completely healthy and that if I chose to, I could have children in the future. I sat on my floor and wept, not from grief, but from sheer, overwhelming relief. They had tried to steal my womanhood, but they had failed. That evening, I walked down to the water's edge. I carried a single manila folder containing the last physical copies of my medical records from the Langford era. I built a small fire in a drift of dry wood. One by one, I fed the pages into the flames. I watched the names Victoria and Patrick curl into black ash and float away on the sea breeze. I stood there until the fire died down, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I was Isabella Crane, and I was whole. I did not need to hate them anymore. I had won the only way that mattered. I was going to live a long, full, and happy life, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop me. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. I would love to hear from you. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people.